Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto was a gamer between dimensions. When a boy wakes up in the world of Naruto with no memory of the past, foggy memories of the future, and a convenient gamer-like ability, so what's he to do? The only option is to get stronger and move forward. Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard! Chapter 24. Yoru blinked. Then he blinked again. He looked around, noting that he was still in that snake's chamber. This was also supplemented by the fact that said snake was staring at him carefully while still smoking that cigarette in her mouth. He regarded her for a second before putting her to the back of his mind and looking at the state of his body. He lifted up his arms and looked at his pristine white scales, which radiated energy and shimmered in the light. He focused on the energy coursing through and around him, glancing at the ethereal snakes made from his senjutsu energy. He reached his hand towards his head and touched his horns. Truly beautiful. Yoru said out loud, his expression serene. He was simply stating a fact about himself, uncaring about the other individuals in his vicinity. He then clenched his fist, feeling the raw energy within him before he utilized it in order to control the white energy snakes around him. They hissed and coiled according to Yoru's will, and he stroked them as if they were alive. "You must have helped me up, right?" Yoru said while petting his ethereal snakes. The snake sage blinked. "I did n dash. My words were not directed at you." Yoru replied simply, cutting the snake off. The snake sage looked at Yoru blandly, though she felt somewhat amused by this sudden change in personality. In response to his words, Yoru swore he heard some gusts of wind blowing some form of complaints besides him. He could barely be bothered with those 3 gusts of wind behind him. However, their antics served to irritate him. "Silence," Yoru said, using his spiritual pressure to quiet the gusts of wind blowing noises in his ears. With that, they blew no more, and he continued his focus on his ethereal snakes, who seemed to have some sort of will of their own as they joyfully coiled around his arm. Seeing me on the floor of all things, it must have been unbearable. The apparent target of his words, the white energy snakes, hissed in agreement. As Yoru finished petting his energy snakes, he graced the large snake in front of him with the view of his visage and looked up. The white snake sage lowered her head and looked to Yoru in intrigue. "Interesting," she stated as she observed Yoru's detached and aloof expression. "I've never seen such a transformation occur after obtaining my snake sage transformation." She then raised her head back up and nodded in approval. "Since you passed the test, I accept you. That is only natural, I am perfect," Yoru stated calmly as he stared up at the white snake sage. "That being said, it's like being looked down at, lower your head." The snake sage looked at Yoru humorously before she chuckled. "Truly an interesting anomaly," she said as she released some smoke from her cigarette. "And what if I don't?" Yoru's expression remained unwavering as he simply tapped his foot off the ground. The floor beneath his feet shattered as he zoomed into the air before flipping and landing on the white snake sage's head. "Then I'll simply step over you." The snake sage chuckled in low octaves before it turned into full-blown laughter. "You're an amusing little thing. I'll tell you that, hatchling." Yoru didn't answer her words as he took in the much grander view of his surroundings. He asked, "Tell me, how long have I been in that state?" "You have my permission to speak." 5 days. The snake sage replied as she took another puff of her cigarette and let the smoke saturate the immediate atmosphere. Yoru blew the smoke away with a single breath while he absently thought about how irritating it would be if he had missed Kushina giving birth. That being said, Yoru knew it had been him who had asked her to grant him her power, so if he did miss the baby's birth, that was on him. He would never admit that out loud, however. Yoru released a sigh, the soft expression on his face creating a radiant picturesque view that was only further exemplified by the pure white energy being released from his body. "Very well." With that, there was a pause. No one spoke. The white snake sage continued to smoke without care, as if Yoru wasn't even on her head, while the boy in question remained unmoving, an unreadable expression on his face. Ichikishimaheim, Tajitsuheim, and Tagariheim remained speechless the entire time. Never had they seen such blatant disrespect and disregard towards the white snake sage go so completely unpunished. They wanted to say something, but they felt like they didn't have the right to speak any words. From Yoru, they had felt an indiscernible pressure leveled at them when he had silenced them, one born not from strength, but from some form of hierarchical suppression. He had felt like a king above them. Say. The white snake sage began. Why don't you become a snake summoner? Compared to Orochimaru, you have much more comparability with us. I truly find something like you truly interesting. Yoru thought for a moment. Since the days of old, kings always had exotic animals that displayed their grace and bearing, from lions to tigers to even snakes. As someone with an incredibly majestic presence, one above that of any king, it was important for him to have a pet that would exemplify his bearing multifariously. Yoru had at first thought of taking the snake below him, however, he immediately cast away that thought. She was much too old, and having lived in this cave for so long, her body had grown together with the ground. It would be quite inconvenient to untangle her entire 20 meters plus long body off around those pillars. No, he needed a fresh pet. Yoru twirled a bit of his white flaming hair around his finger and thought for a moment. If he was going to get a pet, he needed one that was powerful and could at the very least accompany him as his strength rapidly grew. However, a creature fit for his stature and also able to accompany him as his power rose was nearly impossible to find, in this realm at least. Would he have to wait? Yoru's brows furrowed. Suddenly, he gained a brilliant idea. If I can't wait, then why don't I make one? Yoru said to himself. With this brilliant thought, he stated, I agree, however, I will go and personally create my partner. Sure, do whatever. She said bemusedly. Have those three shows you around? Yoru didn't answer as he hopped off her head and for the first time, barely regarded the three gusts of air as he spoke a few sentences. Direct me to the hatchery. That said, he walked past them and down the stairs, as if he expected them to follow him from behind. Why would they not? Who would disrespect him? As for the reason he was walking ahead of them even though he had asked them to direct him, who would dare to walk in front of him? As expected, the three gusts of air followed behind him and pointed out the directions to the hatchery where the baby snakes manifested. Exiting the building in which the snake sage resided, they took a right here, a left there, another left, until finally, they arrived at their destination. Yoru's golden eyes gleamed as he swept the surroundings and took note of the numerous hatchling snakes within. As if noting the grandeur of his majesty, they all stopped moving and lifted their heads towards him, as if awaiting orders. Yoru walked to the center of the room, the snakes parting way for his arrival. A kunai in hand, Yoru augmented it with senjutsu and brought it down on his wrist. His arm flew off and blood spurted out like a torrent of water. With his will, Yoru easily manipulated and drew out more blood from his body while holding onto his dislodged hand. With that, he reattached his cut of hand to the spot it came from and twisted it a little before the wound sealed shut. After flexing his wrist and clenching his hand a few times, Yoru nodded his head in satisfaction. A big glob of his previous blood stood floating in the air in front of him while he looked around at the snakes standing to attention. One of you will grow up to be my precious pet. He iterated before continuing. The rest of you will perish. That said, he controlled his glob of blood and split it off into numerous droplets which he then integrated into the bodies of all the hatchlings here. Of course, even aiming for such an honor will require you to go through a trial. Yoru said simply. If you can survive my blood, then you have potential. If more than one of you survive, well. Yoru turned his back and began walking towards the exit. I only need one pet. As soon as he arrived at the door and exited the room, the snakes writhed in pain on the floor as their body fought to accept and adapt to Yoru's blood. The door of the hatchery closed behind him. He waited there, ignoring the three gusts of wind beside him, as he stood ramrod straight, his hands clasped behind his back and his head held high. Silence reigned once more. He waited. And waited some more. And then. "It is done," Yoro said as he turned around and opened the door to the hatchery. Inside, the smell of blood was thick as the corpses of hatchling snakes were scattered all over the ground. Yoru looked ahead. There, in the center of it all, was a snake whose scales were almost as pure white and pristine as his own and whose eyes shimmered with a golden radiance. It seemed like it had a great affinity with his blood as it manifested a powerful presence. Yoru looked at it unemotionally. "Come." The hatchling snake immediately obeyed and slithered towards Yoru before attempting to coil up his body. Yoru's apparently sentient ethereal energy snakes hissed and moved around the hatchling snake, watching and judging it. Seemingly satisfied, they allowed the hatchling snake to coil up Yoru's body. He smiled at their antics and maneuvered the hatchling to coil around his left arm. Bringing it closer to his face, Yoru observed it, noting that it was actually a female before he nodded and simply stated, "Your name will be Levia. Accept it graciously." The snake hissed happily and coiled itself tightly on Yoru's arm, causing him to smile. "You will be my precious partner, and as you share my blood, you will quickly grow powerful. Rejoice." With that, Yoru waved his free hand and sent the carcasses of the hatchling snakes into the ground using his manipulation over the earth. There were numerous hatcheries in the Ryuchi caves, and even if there hadn't been, there were plenty of adult snakes for reproduction. "Give me the contract," Yoru stated without even looking at the three snake women behind him. Ichikishimaheim, Tajitsuheim, and Tagiriheim felt wronged. However, despite how irritated they still felt that invisible presence emanating from Yoru pushing down on them. Tajitsuheim snapped her fingers and in a puff, a snakeskin scroll appeared in her hand. "Sign here with your blood and you'll have a contract with us." With no hesitation, Yoru slit his wrist once more and signed his name in blood on the snakeskin parchment. Suddenly, the letters glowed before on Yoru's arm, a summoning tattoo, in the shape of a snake coiling around his wrist, appeared and solidified on his skin. Yoru admired his new tattoo for a moment and thought about how at the age of 11, he already had 2 tattoos. He wondered if he was a good influence on Mito. After these thoughts flitted through Yoru's mind, he walked outside the hatchery, completely ignoring the 3 gusts of wind before he spoke out loud, seemingly to himself. "My work here is done. Our presence is no longer required." With that, the energy around him receded. His scales disappeared. His horns vanished. His eyes returned to their silver coloring. And his pupils became normal once more. He then blinked. Ah! Yoru, gamer dash. Thinking about what had just happened in the past few minutes caused me to be speechless. I knew that some forms of sage transformation could cause one to go insane, but I had no idea it could cause someone to become so. And since Gamer's mind hadn't activated to block that personality, that meant I had been perfectly sane. The thought caused my lips to twitch. As for where I currently was, well, after I stopped using my sage transformation mode, I immediately vanished from the area with ID Create and made my way towards Konoha. I had no idea how well my supposed newfound suppression effect on snakes worked without sage mode, and I truly did not care to find out. I knew that the snake sage apparently wasn't affected by my majestic aura or whatever, and I also knew that Ichikishimaheim, Tajitsuheim, and Tagiriheim weren't quite happy with my other personality. It was probably for the beat that I left the place as soon as sage mode had worn off. My newfound second personality wasn't one I wanted to bring out all that often. In but a few moments, the view of the city gates appeared in my view, and since I was still in my ID, I simply entered them. After going to and entering my apartment, I exited the ID. Immediately after, I noticed something. I frowned. Through my energy resonance, I could sense a lot of high-level chakra signatures. Foreign chakra signatures. Having lived in this place for many years and unintentionally memorizing all the shinobi chakra signatures in the village, courtesy of eidetic memory, I could easily spot the new powerful chakra signatures as foreign entities. Who were they? And why were they here? More importantly, what had I missed in these past 5 days? Seeing as the village was intact, it didn't seem like a gigantic angry fox had come through and rampaged here. This either meant Kushina had given birth with no issues and my involvement and worries had been unfounded, or, more likely given my luck, she hadn't given birth yet. I suppose a visit to the Hokage is in order. I thought before exiting my room and making my way to the Hokage building where I could sense him. And he wasn't alone. With a couple of hops through the rooftops of Konoha's buildings, I made my way towards Minato and dropped down in front of the Hokage office before making my way inside. Having already seen me numerous times, the guards readily allowed me inside. I quickly made my way up some of the stairs before coming across the secretary who was busy doing some work. She raised her head from her papers and glanced at me before breaking out in a smile. I'm assuming you are here to see the Hokage, however, he is in a highly important meeting right now, Yoru. Though I would usually let you in, I don't think you want to be in there with them. Just as she said that, the door to the office opened. Out came a very short, older man with a triangular beard and a mustache that had angular corners, a big red nose, and thick eyebrows. The top of his head was starting to recede, though he still had long graying hair on the lower half of his head, which was styled in a traditional Chanmich haircut, the back of which was tied with a yellow ribbon into a topknot. Finally, the man wore a green and yellow coat with a red collar and was floating in the air as he exited the office. I frowned. I knew of him. Like every Kage, his face was plastered in the bingo book. The third Tsuchikage. Anoki. Minato stated from inside his office as he looked at the Tsuchikage. I appreciate your offer, however, I alone am unable to guarantee anything without support from my shinobi council. I hope you understand. Of course. The man said as he floated up and down in the air. I will be awaiting further discussion later tonight. Minato nodded, a slight smile on his face, before he glanced my way and blinked. Yoru? Seeing this, the Tsuchikage also paid attention to my presence with a surprised look. Then his emotions turned dark. There was no visible change of expression on his face. But I could feel it. His negative emotions. He did not like me. I internally frowned, wondering why or how he would feel that way. Wasn't I too adorable to be hated? No, wait, more importantly. I'll take my leave. The Tsuchikage stated before looking at me with a calm smile. But I have to say, your village's shinobi are quite something. So young yet I can sense so much potential within him. Minato smiled. You overpraise. Anoki chuckled slightly before floating past me along with the 2 guards who had accompanied his side. Time seemed to slow down as he brushed past me, and I could sense his emotions reaching their peak as he did. Before they calmed down as he walked out the door. I looked back to where he had disappeared to and narrowed my eyes. He was dangerous. Come in, Yoru. Minato stated as he walked back into his office. I nodded and followed him in before closing the door behind me and plopping a seat on one of the chairs. Orochimaru told me about your supposed vacation. Minato said with a raised brow. How was it? Productive. I answered. I just needed some time for myself, you know. He pointed at my left arm where the levia was coiled and sleeping. And you just happened to pick up an albino snake along the way? I decided it would be best to change the subject. What happened while I was gone? Coming in, I felt a lot of foreign chakra signatures, so I was curious as to who they belonged to and why they were here. Minato blinked. Ah, right, sensor, and perfect recall. He then explained. After your successful mission, we were able to separate ourselves from Hirako with his corpse as proof. As a result of that, a few days ago, we received a request from Earth Country to foster more peace talks between our nations since the tensions had gotten so high from Hirako's machinations. But Tsuchikage even volunteered to personally fly over here as a sign of goodwill, as he would be in enemy territory. IWA? Peace talks? With Konoha? I asked somewhat skeptically. Those words mix as well as oil and water. Minato smiled ruefully. I know, but it would be much better not to have to worry about them. Reducing the conflict between our nations would be best for us both. I nodded in understanding. We all lost a lot during that war. It only makes sense to keep them low. With a nod in agreement, Minato continued. Not too long after we got that message, we received an offer for a peace treaty from Kyumo, and they delegated their head shinobi along with an envoy to sign the treaty. Thump. I frowned. Instinct caused the hairs on my body to slightly raise. It a premonition. Something doesn't quite feel right here. I started looking at my hands before looking at Minato. Also, for some reason, the third Tsuchikage's thoughts turned dark when he saw me. I have a feeling that their peace talks aren't as innocent as they seem on the surface. Minato looked me in the eye and nodded. I already have both the Uchiha and Hyuga watch over their every move. I've had them keep track of any sort of interaction between the two. Besides that, my teacher and the other two Sannin are officially out of the village while unofficially, they are on standby. Believe me, having both Kyumo and IWA inside my village is not something I take lightly. I frowned as my instinct persisted, but I nodded my head nonetheless. Besides, because Minato had earlier decided to bring back all our on-duty shinobi, our village was much more secure than usual. With the Sannin here, unofficially, in addition to Aruzan, the enemies wouldn't be able to make it out here alive if they tried something. Anyway, soon I'll have to entertain Kyumo's delegates so we can pick up another time. Minato stated before adding as if he had just remembered. Also, make sure you go see Nito and Kushina. Minato said with a smile. Nito has missed you while Kushina has been irate the past few days you have been gone. The more time you waste, the more upset she'll become. I sighed internally. I idly stroked Livia. This is going to be a pain. Yoru, gamer dash. I'm pretty mad. Kushina offhandedly before her eyes narrowed as she stared at me. What would you have done if you missed my baby's birthday? Ha? What were you thinking? Disappearing on me for 5 days like that? I apologize if I caused you to worry, however, there were important things I needed to do. I replied simply, before looking her straight in the eyes. Believe me when I say it was for you and your safety. You? She paused and looked at me softly. Suddenly, Kushina brought me in close, hugging me to her chest as she looked at me smilingly. She stroked my head. Really, I hope my children grow up to be like you. I didn't say a word as I let her continue rubbing my head. It felt very comfortable. And her chest felt nice. Though I do have to ask, where did you go in? She paused for a moment. Is that a snake around your arm? I let go of her and nodded. Her name is Livia and I got her from Ryuchi Cave. Kushina raised a brow. That snake den? Why would you go there? Obviously to get a summon. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at me searchingly. Oh? Is that all? She looked at me for a while longer before shaking her head. As long as you don't get yourself into something you can't get out of. I didn't. I said simply. Believe me, it will be fine. She seemed to want to say more, but she simply sighed and leaned back into the couch. Seeing this, I decided to figure out the descriptions of my new abilities, so I thought to myself. Status. System update, 0.27396767%. I blinked and tried again. Status. System update, 0.27396768%. Oh. Well, that sucked. Wait, does that mean? I turned my deconstructive analysis towards Kushina and tried to see if I could read her status. Well, there was good news and bad news. The bad news was that observing her didn't give me some sort of status screen to look at. The good news was that my eyes were still able to provide me with a good approximation of her strength even though I didn't have a display telling me all her stats and levels. This meant that I could still tell how much STR, VI, DX, etc. someone had, but I wouldn't get a precise number since my system was shut down. Hey Yoru. Kushina said with a lazy glance, though I could sense a sternness to her gaze as she continued. I was going to ask Kakashi, but now that you are here, I figured I would ask you. I looked up. What's up? In a little bit, I would like you to go pick up your little sister from the academy. She requested before I felt some negative emotions emanating from her as she continued. I don't want her walking around the village unattended, not with Kumo here. And then I understood. Kushina had no goodwill towards Kumobikure whatsoever, mainly due to her experience when she was just a genin and they had tried to kidnap her. I nodded my head. If they dare to harm a hair on her adorable head, I'll kill them. She twitched a smile. If you did that, we'd have a much bigger problem in our hands. Just make sure she's safe. I will. With that, she sighed contentedly and leaned back into the couch while closing her eyes. I'm so tired. She said softly before her breathing became lighter. After using my eyes and magical touch for a few minutes, just to make sure she didn't wake up anytime soon, I stood up to leave. I could sense Kakashi guarding the outside of the house, so I didn't worry about Kushina too much. Besides, you would have to be pretty stupid to attack Minato Namake's home and wife. With that, I thought for a moment and decided to head to the academy and wait till Mito was done for the day. Before that, however, I placed my hand on Kushina's stomach and sensed the vigorous life force within her. It's almost time, at any moment now she could give birth. I thought before retracting my hand and changing Kushina's resting position slightly before covering her with a blanket from my inventory. With that, I headed outside. I took a look at the bustling and excitement unfolding within the city. I could sense little to no more tension within the village folk as they walked around and continued on with their daily lives. With that, my feet carried me towards my destination. To be honest, I'd always had a lot of doubts about Kushina's kidnapping within the village. How exactly were foreign shinobi able to get into the barriers of the strongest shinobi nation and kidnap such a high-profile individual such as Kushina Uzumaki? And it wasn't like those shinobi were all that powerful either, as Minato, a low jonin level shinobi at the time, had easily killed them and saved Kushina. Additionally, how did he even know she was kidnapped? What, was he stalking her that entire night? The thing about the Minato finding her due to her hair may or may not have been true, but he had definitely been warned somehow. Of course, I didn't think he was a part of whatever conspiracy had been going on, as he had still just been a kid at the time. He had most likely just been a good chess piece to make things move along in the most favorable fashion. I was betting my money Danzo had something to do with it. That guy would do just about anything, and I meant anything, if it meant that Konoha would continue to reign supreme. Trying to keep an Uzumaki, the only clan of individuals who could safely accommodate the Nine Tails, within the village walls was without a doubt something he would no doubt consider. That being said, I could respect his devotion. I definitely could not understand it though. I had never brought out my doubts for a few reasons. 1. Telling a married and loving couple, who already had a child together, that their relationship had been built on a conspiracy was probably just a tad bit insensitive. 2. By this time, they most likely already figured something like that had happened. Kushina and Minato weren't idiots, but by this point in time, what was even the point of thinking about it? They already had one kid together, with another one coming in along the way, plus they were all gooey for each other. Last but not least, I simply didn't really care all that much. Minato and Kushina loved each other, empathy doesn't lie, so why should I care how that came to be? Besides, I would rather not stick my head in something like this lest I get dragged down into a quagmire I wanted no part in. Konoha was a shinobi village and had done much more immoral things in the past. They hadn't stayed on top by being kind and generous to others. You would have to be a naive fool to believe otherwise. With that long tirade of thoughts having completely run through my mind, I arrived at the academy. I waited outside its gates with my back leaned against a tree before I furrowed my brows. My head turned and I scanned the area where I had felt the foreign chakra signature. They were hidden by the dense passerbys that walked along the streets, so I couldn't get a good view of them, but empathy could tell that their intentions were anything but pure. Her gaze seemed to be focused on the academy as if they were waiting for something or someone. Well, as long as they didn't do anything out of line, I was disinclined to act, so with that, I closed my eyes and waited as time passed. As the sun's position changed in the sky, the chakra signature never changed its position while the village people continued to excitedly move around and about. Only after a few hours did I open my eyes and look to the direction of the academy. With my level of stealth, these kids wouldn't be able to notice me even if I stood right next to them, so I wouldn't have to worry about that embarrassing scene from the last time I had visited this place. The only way anyone would be able to find me would be if they were stronger and more experienced than me, or if they were a decent sensor and I allowed them to sense my chakra. Children poured out of the building, probably having finished learning the best way to stab someone through the throat. Ah, I remember those lessons from my teacher. Yoru. An adorable voice sounded out from the distance. I lifted my head up and smiled at the girl as she came my way, most likely having sensed my chakra. Just before she reached me, she dove towards me, so I quickly positioned myself and caught her. I stroked her head. "How are you doing?" "5 days." She replied with her head buried in my stomach. I tilted my head. She looked up to me with a pout. "You didn't visit me for 5 days even though you weren't on a mission. That's terrible. I hate you." I opened my mouth, but then decided not to tell her that I had been unconscious, because I had decided to let a snake inject me with natural energy. Though I found her reaction amusing, as she clearly didn't hate me, which only meant she wanted something. So, I asked, "What do you want, my cute little sister?" She paused, looking at my left arm for a moment before her eyes widened and sparkled. "Is that a baby snake?" I blinked, looking at my arm before idly stroking Livia. "Yeah, her name is Livia, and she is a comrade of mine." Her eyes glittering, Mito reached out her hand. "Can I hold her?" Livia raised her head and glanced at Mito before turning her head towards me. I nodded. "Why don't you keep her company for a little bit? She is my little sibling after all." Livia blinked before slithering into Mito's grasp. She placed Livia around her neck and smiled as she stroked her scales. Then, she blinked as if remembering something and looked at me with a pout. "You have to carry me home." She beamed with her arms raised. I rolled my eyes and picked her up before putting her on my shoulders. "You're so spoiled." "Hee, you're the best, big bro. And criminally adorable." With that, I began my trek back to Kushina's place, with Mito playfully swinging her legs along the way while she played with Livia. We passed by the hustle and bustle of the crowd and took in the excitable atmosphere as we moved along. And then, I stopped. "HM? Yoru?" Mito asked at my sudden halt. I shook my head. "Nothing. If we ignore it, it might go away." "Ignore what?" she asked cutely. I frowned. "A pest." "Hey, kid!" A male voice shouted from behind me, the sound of his footsteps quickly approaching. I furrowed my brows and thought of simply teleporting back, but then Mito would probably make me carry her for the rest of the day. I sighed and turned my head to face him with a bored expression. "What?" He stopped and scratched the back of his head with a smile. "Ah, I'm sorry if I bothered you. I just couldn't help but notice how similar you look to my brother." I didn't think I'd see a native from Lightning Country that wasn't part of the delegation this far out. I looked at the man, noting his dark skin, white hair, and black eyes. More important than that, however, was the Kumogakure forehead protector he wore on his forehead. "Is that so?" I asked rhetorically. "Well, I'm not from there, and it looks like you were mistaken, so I'll take my leave." I then turned to walk away. "Ah, wait!" he yelled, waving at me. I turned my gaze to him before he continued. "I'm actually just a little bit lost and got separated from my group with all the people moving about. You wouldn't mind helping me, would you?" "Yoru." Mito began before I could reply, tightening her grip around my neck. I don't like his chakra. The man froze. That's because his very existence is a plague on this earth. I replied, looking at the man apathetically. In essence. I began, walking right up to him. He's scum. I finished, shoving him away. The expression on the man's face changed multiple times while his emotions were that of pure rage and bloodlust. I ignored him and continued on my way while the guy behind me followed me no longer. Now, why was I such an ass to the guy who seemed to be a decent individual? For one, based on his chakra, I knew he had been the guy who had been watching the academy, so the thing about him getting separated from his group was horseshit. Next, empathy told me enough about his disgusting emotions which made his whole decent guy persona a complete fabrication. He had been following us ever since I had picked up Mito, meaning that he had been aiming at her. Furthermore, this meant that he and by extension Kumo had not come here with any pure intentions whatsoever. If that was the case, I'll kill him, slowly. However, even if I told Minato this, he had already taken every possible precaution necessary. Very few people knew that all three Sannin were within the village walls since they tended to come and go as they pleased. In addition, Hiruzen was still here and Minato wasn't a pushover. I would, however, let him know so that he could increase his vigilance. I wasn't sure if IWA was playing this game, but seeing how confident that Kumo Shinobi seemed to be that he dared to stalk Mito at Konoha Academy, I wouldn't be surprised if IWA was another player. That, however, made me think about what could give that guy so much assurance. Both IWA and Kumo had brought some high-level shinobi from what I could sense, but they weren't anywhere near the level of strength necessary to start something here. If they wanted to even try something, they would at least need to bring their Jinchuriki, but I could sense that they weren't here either. Minato wasn't stupid and wouldn't let a nuke into his home if he didn't have the contro. Wait. Something suddenly came to me. The Nine Tails. Wasn't there a chance that it would go free during Kushina's birth? I mean, it wasn't an issue now since I had a foolproof plan in place to prevent it from escaping Kushina, but what if they were here waiting for such an opportunity? The thought hit me like tsunami, causing me to pause. Yoru? What's wrong? Mito asked. I shook my head and calmed down. Nothing. In the first place, Kushina's identity as the Ninetales Jinchuriki was very well kept. Additionally, the fact that she had been pregnant had been extremely well hidden. As in, the moment she had showed visual signs of her pregnancy, she had been confined to the home while I had run around as her errand boy. The point was that I was basically impossible for Kumo and IWA to not only know that Kushina was the Ninetales Jinchuriki but to also know that she was pregnant and about to give birth. Even if they knew that they wouldn't be able to access her while she was giving birth unless I personally allowed them into my PD. And why the hell would I do that? And to think that all I had to do was pick up Mito and go home. Why did I have to run into this mess? Teacher is right. I always find myself in odd situations. The finality of those thoughts coincided with my arrival back to the Uzumaki Namake's estate. I sighed and opened the door to the house with Mito on my shoulders. We're home, I said as I picked her up from my shoulders and placed her down. She immediately hugged me. Thank you. I looked down at her and patted her head while in thought. I have something for you, I said as I looked down at her. She raised her head up at me questioningly. Seeing this, I opened the palm of my right hand and concentrated my wind and water-natured chakra before forming a chain of crystal blue ice. Each chain link was small and slowly interconnected with each other to form a necklace at the end of which contained an ice crystal in the shape of a diamond. Next, lines of Fuinjutsu script spread from my hands and covered the ice necklace. It was a complicated sealing matrix I had developed for Mito's protection. It combined the basic energy containment seal among other things to allow my manifested chakra-born ice to last a very long time. One done, the seals on the necklace turned invisible and I placed it around Mito's neck. Now, I'll place a drop of your blood on it. Before she could react, I poked her skin hard enough to draw a drop of blood and immediately healed it before she could feel anything. I then manipulated it with water and magnet release before dropping it on the necklace. The blue ice crystal necklace turned red for a few moments, during which Mito's eyes were staring in wonder at it. The necklace shrunk around her neck before perfectly fitting around it, making it impossible to remove by pulling it off her head. Afterward, the red hue disappeared before the necklace slowly turned blue again. "What is this? It looks so pretty," she asked excitedly. I smiled. "Think of it as your late birthday gift," I said while rubbing her head. The concept of it was pretty simple. I had condensed almost all of my chakra into forming that necklace, which functioned to produce a barrier that would repel foreign chakra signatures from approaching. Of course, she could consciously allow individuals to use their chakra on her, such as medical ninja, but for the most part, it repelled all forms of ninjutsu from getting into contact with her. Granted, the barrier wasn't indestructible and a powerful enough attack could get through it. Additionally, it only blocked ninjutsu and not physical attacks, so she would be susceptible to those. The best part was that it could use Mito's chakra to replenish itself, hence why I had made it using the DNA from her hair. Of course, I would explain its function to Minato and Kushina later on. "Go upstairs and clean yourself off," I told Mito, who was still fiddling with her necklace. She nodded absent-mindedly and walked off, leaving me here in the corridor of the front door. I watched her leave before I moved to the living room where Kushina was still resting soundly and sat down on an empty couch. I gazed at her sleeping form before looking up to the ceiling. I'm tired. It was more of mental fatigue than anything else. All this worrying really wasn't good for anything. Abruptly, the sound of the door clicking and opening reached my ears. "You're back early," I said to the individual who had just arrived. He sighed. Talking peace with Kumo was like kicking an iron sheet, completely pointless. He said as he tossed his white Haori cloak on an empty couch and plopped down on it. I caught one spying on the academy, presumably waiting on Mito. I stated offhandedly. I doubt they really came here to foster peace between our nations. Minato frowned then sighed. Yeah, I figured that they were planning something when they were acting so obstinate. I blinked. Wait, you knew? And you're still risking keeping them in the village? I don't know what they are planning, but I know that they aren't here for peace as they claimed. He said before continuing, regardless, I won't have a reason to kick them out unless they make a move. I thought for a moment. This is a risky game. Letting your enemies move about within your home despite knowing they are up to something. Soon my wife will give birth. Minato stated, looking at Kushina's sleeping form. My expression changed. You came to the same conclusion. It would be too much of a coincidence otherwise. Minato explained. If your intuition is on point and something would go wrong during her birth. I shook my head. All of this is based off a vague nightmare I had. Besides, I promised you that the place I would be taking you would be completely inaccessible to anyone other than me and people I allow. And I trust you. Minato stated. Thank you. I replied. And besides, too many assumptions are being made to center all of this around Kushina. It's more likely that they came here with some other plan in mind. We are also assuming that they are here to cause damage during their stay. They could just as easily be scouting us and gathering intel before leaving. Wouldn't that be the most ideal scenario? He replied with a sigh. I looked at his exhausted frame for a moment before stating. Honestly, you should just shatter all pretense and kick them out. At most, they'll be left with some sour feelings. He didn't reply for a moment before explaining, regardless of why they are here, if they decide to act against us during their stay, we will legitimately be able to capture and interrogate them for any information they have. The fact that Kumo and IWA might be planning something against us and that they have the courage to come up here means that there is something much deeper going on. I won't rest assured until I figure out what. I didn't say anything after that. Near silence then reigned between us, the ticking of the clock being the only other audible sound. Suddenly, I thought of something else. By the way, if you've already finished discussing with Kyumo and are now home, then who is talking with Iwagakure? Ah, them? Minato asked rhetorically. The third Hokage is meeting with Inoki as we speak, so if Iwa does try to do something. His expression remained calm as his eyes narrowed slightly. They won't come out alive. Yoru, Gamer Dash. A few hours later, third-person POV. What are you playing at, Inoki? Hiruzen thought to himself as he sat down in a seiza position on the floor mat, his gaze lingering on the individual sitting across from him. The third Hokage was meeting with the third Tsuchikage inside one of the buildings used to house high-profile guests and the like. Both of their presences inside the living room created an imperceptibly dense atmosphere where the air felt heavier to everyone else aside from the two individuals sitting on the opposite ends of the table. You're aging quite well, Hiruzen stated, melting some of the tension from the frozen atmosphere. Inoki, the third Tsuchikage, chuckled. You flatter me, Sandame, but my back has been telling me otherwise. He flinched as he reached his arm to rub it. It really hasn't been the same as time has passed by. Time is the enemy of every man, Hiruzen stated with a genial smile. No matter who we've become or what we've accomplished, we'll all visit the Pure Land one day. The only thing we leave behind is our legacy. Legacy. You're right, Inoki agreed with a nod. It is our duty as Kage to ensure that the legacy of our continues on, regardless of the cost. Hiruzen showed a smile that was not a smile. And what cost would you be willing to take? If it is to pass on the will of stone to my village's progeny, I would bid my life, Inoki answered seriously. I wholeheartedly agree, Hiruzen replied. As long as I can pass down the torch of the will of fire, I will be able to die without regrets. A round of silence ensued between the two Kage. Did you know? Inoki suddenly began. Eventually, a fire will be extinguished, but a stone can last indefinitely. The air coagulated. The shinobi besides their kages tensed and prepared for the case where all pretense was shredded. Hiruzen frowned at what was obviously a not-so-thinly veiled threat before he smiled, but if a fire burns hot enough, even a stone will be melted to nothing more than a puddle. But even then, it can always cool down and resolidify into the same stone, Inoki countered. Its structure may change, but it can be hammered into shape, removing its impurities and making it purer and more durable than before. Likewise, Hiruzen began, a fire can always be relit as long as there is someone to carry the torch. They stopped here and looked at each other with a smile, seemingly coming to some sort of understanding that no one else in the room was privy to. What can I help you with, Inoki? Hiruzen asked, his face turning stoic. The old Tsuchikage answered, as you know, Iwagakure probably lost the most from our conflict, from our soldiers to some of our land, we've suffered the greatest casualties. No doubt in part due to your own stubbornness, Hiruzen thought. Instead, he said, certainly, in war, the measure of victory isn't by whether you win or not but by how little you lose compared to the opposition. I can understand the scope of your frustration. By your very own definition, Inoki began. Konoha was the biggest winner of this entire event, what with its newfound ability to revitalize its previously crippled soldiers. It really made it difficult for the rest of us to keep up with your continually replenishing forces. In addition, you've also managed to secure the Three Tails, granted it apparently hadn't been your intention to do so. Hiruzen barely let a smile slip on his lips, but he didn't say anything. What's worse, Inoki began, is that we lost our Jinchuriki but till this day we haven't found our bijou. I was curious if you knew anything about that? Hiruzen blinked. Now that he thought about it, it was quite strange that Iwagakure hadn't found their bijou by now. It wasn't like they took that long to reform, at most about a year, so they should have found it by now. Actually, here exactly did Danzo say Yoru disappeared off to when he killed Rashi? Hiruzen was pretty sure that bit of information was never obtained. If the four tails truly hadn't appeared by now, then he was really curious as to where Yoro had killed off the four tails Jinchuriki. It wasn't like he had vanished into a different world or anything, so the four tails should have popped up. To be honest, I couldn't tell you, Hiruzen stated. I myself am clueless as to what really happened during that mission. I see. There was a short tense moment of silence before Inoki continued. You know, I've heard you've got another prodigy in the making. The third raised a brow. Konoha has been blessed with incredible shinobi over its years. He began. We have many up-and-coming prodigies in the village. Inoki sneered distastefully in his heart before elaborating. This one is apparently of a different breed from what a little bird told me. He's especially talented. Oh? Hiruzen replied with furrowed brows. Inoki nodded with a careless smile. He's such a genius in fact that he was apparently able to devise a method to improve upon the traditional mystic palm technique. Inoki stated, watching the changing expression of Hiruzen's face. And allow it to regenerate lost limbs among other crippling physical afflictions. Hiruzen's eyes narrowed dangerously. Yoro being found out was something he had expected, but not for a while longer. Many precautions had been taken to hide his identity, except for extenuating circumstances like that of Tsunade's student. He had grilled her for that, with Jiraiya having been used as a scapegoat for most of Yoru's accomplishments. The fact that his identity had been found was somewhat concerning, but not too much. Nothing was foolproof in the end. Yes, well, as I said earlier. Hiruzen began, a false smile on his face. We have many prodigies in my village. He's just one of many. You give him too little credit. Inoki stated with a light chuckle. After all, he was able to kill the four-tailed Jinchuriki. Hiruzen's expression changed. It was one thing to know about Yoro, but it was another thing entirely to know who Yoro was. From when he was 4 he had been trained more or less in secret before he joined Root, where his identity became heavily secretive. There were only about 17 individuals in Konoha who knew how monstrous he was, one of whom was dead, while even fewer knew he had created mystical healing. Additionally, Yoro kept to himself and didn't interact much with others, and therefore he didn't have any sort of reputation amongst the general populace. His existence wasn't renowned in any way, and no one outside of the individuals who had partaken in the mission, and of course Danzo and himself, against Rashi, should have known that Yoru dealt the killing blow. Yet somehow, Inoki had found out this information. Inoki. Hiruzen began, articulating the third Tsuchikige's name slowly and gravely. What is your purpose in coming here? The Tsuchikige sneered. To confirm something told to me by a little tree, and it seems like they were right. Konoha has been keeping something of Iwa's for some time now, and I'm here to take it back. Hiruzen frowned. What are you talking about? Are you still going to pretend at this junction? The third Tsuchikage asked with a ridiculing smile visible on his visage. The Four Tails hasn't been seen since he had been killed by your shinobi years ago. It is evident that you've kept it somewhere, probably sealed away inside another host, just like what you did with Kiri's 3 tails. I want it back. I'm afraid there is nothing for us to give. Hiruzen stated succinctly. We aren't in possession of the Four Tails, so I would appreciate it if you ceased hurling such accusations at me and my village. Is that so? Inoki said slowly before pausing and smiling. Then, they felt it. An enormous chakra signature encompassed the village, suffocating everyone with its immense pressure. A primal bestial roar reverberated throughout Konoha, causing windows and glass to shatter throughout. Hiruzen's expression and those of the Umbu beside him drastically changed. Oi, what's going on? What is this pressure? This? Hiruzen narrowed his eyes and stood up, his gaze boring into Inoki's calm visage. Inoki! What have you wrought to my village? The Tsuchikage expression remained unchanged. I, unfortunately, cannot take credit for this, but I will tell you that things, eventually, come full circle. Yoru, Gamer 30 minutes prior, Yoru's POV. We were sitting around the living room with food in hand while Mito played with the necklace I had given her with sparkly eyes. Kushina had woken up some time ago and not too long after, she had complained about being hungry, so I decided to cook something up for the house. Now, we were all enjoying the fruits of my labor. Yoru! Yoru! Minato! Kushina called to us as she sat down peacefully on the couch. The fourth Hokage and I exchanged glances before looking back at Kushina questioningly. She strained a smile. My water broke. Pin. Drop. Silence. The chopsticks that had been halfway to Minato's mouth dropped and clanged against his plate. I abruptly swallowed the food that had already been in my mouth. Mito stopped playing with her necklace for a moment and looked at us before shrugging and continuing on with her thing. Livia raised her head as she lay around Mito's shoulder before she went back to lay down and closed her eyes. Yoru. I know. With that, I promptly dislodged myself from the chair and with my inventory, I quickly put on my Umbu gear. As Minato went over to Kushina, I quickly arrived beside them and placed my hands on their shoulders. Minato looked at me and nodded. I nodded back. With a thought, I took them into my PD and they disappeared. Next, I looked at Mito, noting that she seemed curious as to where her parents disappeared off to. I smiled, don't worry about them and stay here with Livia. Kakashi is also outside if you need anything. She blinked her adorable blue eyes before nodding and continuing to play with her necklace. Seeing that, I went outside the house and looked up at the roof of the residence before saying, Kakashi, watch over Mito for me. Sure. I knew I could count on you. Immediately after that, I dashed across the village to Hiruzen's home where I could sense his wife, Biwako. Simultaneously, I summoned a clone in order for it to gather the reserve Umbu forces Minato had set up to guard the original place Kushina was to give birth in. In very little time, I arrived in front of the Sarutobi household and walked up to the door before knocking on the door. The sound of rapidly approaching footsteps registered in my ears before the door opened. Who is it? The boy who had opened the door, Asuma Sarutobi, stared at me before his eyes looked at me in confusion. Umbu? Why are you here? Something of importance has come up and your mother's presence is required. Allow me to see her so that I can take her to where we need to go. He blinked and nodded before letting me through. I nodded and entered the house before dashing towards where I could sense her chakra signature. Soon after I appeared in front of what appeared to be the living room area of the Sarutobi household. Lady Biwako, your presence is required. I stated to the lady in front of me. She was peacefully sitting down in a seiza while drinking what smelled like tea. Next to her was a woman with shoulder-length brown hair and eyes whose power I could detect placed her at Umbu level. It's already that time? Biwako asked seriously. I nodded. Mom! Where are you going? Asuma yelled from behind me. She smiled at him. I'm just going to do my work. Then she turned to the lady next to her. Taji, let's go. Yes, sensei. The woman stated before in a puff. She donned the standard medical outfit, which consisted of a high-collared white outfit with a poofy hat. I can take you there immediately. I stated as I extended my hands. Grab on. They did so without hesitation. And with a thought, they disappeared into my PD as well. Now, they should be absolutely safe. I thought before I quickly pinpointed the area where I had kept one of my Amanoto Kotachi seal tags. Since Minato had allowed me to be a part of the Umbu responsible for guarding the area around where Kushina would give birth, I had placed some markers around that area on the rocks there. Here we go. Amanoto Kotachi. Immediately, I appeared outside the barrier where Kushina would have normally given birth. It was located on the outskirts of the village on the side of a mountain wall where a hole was carved out. There was a wooden bridge running parallel to the ground a few meters up, going across the face of the mountain. Below my feet was a stream of water while all around me were some trees and vegetation. I hopped up from the stream and simply sat in wait on the edge of the torii, a traditional and large wooden red gate. Soon, friendly chakra signatures appeared in my radar and rapidly approached this area, and before long, I could visually see them approaching. They appeared below me in rapid succession, to which I nodded to them and they nodded back before taking their positions guarding around the area. There were 24 umbu here, including me, which was a much greater number than the 4 that had originally been planned to guard the barrier. With this, there was nothing more to do than wait. And wait some more. I wondered how Kushina was doing. Yoru, gamer. Ah. It hurts, you know. Kushina screamed in agony. Minato lightly sweated in distress. Hang in there, dear. You got through this once and you can do it again. You're not the one that has to go through ahhh. Yoru, gamer. I'm sure she was having a blast. I kept my eyes peeled for any other abnormalities. This was the perfect time for someone to try and interrupt Minato as he focused on keeping the seal in check. I scanned any corner and used my second brain, courtesy of parallel processes, to focus on my empathy and energy resonance skills. Suddenly, a chill ran up my spine. I frowned and hurriedly tried to hone in on my senses, but I came up empty. Were my nerves getting to me? After all, everything had been quiet so far. The only other thing audible was the rustling of the leaves from the trees surrounding us due to the wind. Nothing bad was happening. No one was attacking us. It was peaceful. Too peaceful. A chill, one much greater than the last, coursed through my body and sent me on high alert as I abruptly stood up. What's up? One of the umbu below asked me. My gaze narrowed as I looked towards the direction of the village. Another chill. I tightened my jaw. Something was coming. Something frightening. And then, I felt it. A horrifying pressure descended upon us, one that seemed to almost physically push me down. I could feel the bloodlust contained within the pressure despite the fact that it originated from the village, which was some distance away from this hideout. And then, I heard it. A tremendously powerful roar reverberated from the village, its emergence causing a slight surge of wind to blow in this direction. It was filled with power, malice, and contempt for everything. How? The Nine Tails was still more or less safely managed within Kushina, and it was basically impossible to get to her now. What else could warrant such a terrifying prez? And then, I saw it. My eyes widened. A gigantic red beast stood fully erect in the distance, its fists banging its chest as it roared out. Its 4 thick tails slamming everything and everyone around it indiscriminately. Its eyes were red with madness. I knew what it was. And who it was. It was Son Goku, the four-tailed, tailed beast. Chapter 25. Many thoughts filtered through my mind at this very moment. How? How did the 4 tails get into the village? I should have been able to sense its signature if it had been inside a host, so how was it able to evade my energy resonance and appear out of nowhere? Who? There was no way the 4 tails could sneak into my village undetected. Therefore, someone must have facilitated its intrusion into Konoha's borders, but then that brought the question back to how? How did they get into the village and how did Hei get a hold of Sun? Why? Why was Sun even here? He had not wasted any time in trying to disappear off the grid after having fulfilled his end of the bargain with me. No one else knew of his involvement except Kakashi and I, and even then, we had no idea where he had even disappeared off to. How did he get found? Who found him? Why did they bring the 4 tails here? IWA didn't have the skill and neither did Kumo, but there was no doubt that they were playing a part in this game. I suddenly narrowed my eyes as I felt one of my Amanoto Kotachi markers move position. Earlier when I had made contact with the stalker Kumo ninja, I had made sure to implant my Amanoto Kotachi seal on his person. I had been planning on either killing him when he left the village or torturing him for information on why he had been targeting Mito, but it now served a much more important function. The Kumo shinobi were no doubt taking advantage of the chaos and were moving towards Rage bubbled up within me before it was replaced by a cold seething disdain. They actually dared to go after Mito? I would slowly inquire him for information, however, I wasn't too worried now. Kakashi was still guarding the residence and I was confident enough that he would be able to escape with Mito and hold his own once he sensed them coming. If not, I already had contingencies in place. This was no coincidence. Someone had figured out that Kushina had gone into labor and that the fourth Hokage wasn't around. They had perfectly timed the release of Son Goku within the village. The question was, how did they find out about it? Kushina had gone to labor only 10 minutes or so ago. It was nearly impossible for anyone to figure out that the Hokage was occupied unless they had been right there when her water had broke, which was equally as impossible because I would have been able to sense. My body suddenly shuddered, abruptly ending my thoughts. I looked all around me as I narrowed my eyes, yet I couldn't understand what had just sent my instinct on high alert, aside from the rampaging ape, of course. I abruptly stood up and rapidly looked every which way as I tensed. I didn't know what, but something was coming. Go help stabilize the situation there, I said to the Umbu, as I began to calm myself. They paused at that before one of them spoke up, but we were ordered to guard here. I shook my head. Trust me, your presence would be much more appreciated over there. I'll stay here and handle any situation that is to come. They still seem troubled even if you say that. A beastly roar reverberated throughout Konoha as Sun began swinging his tails, destruction following in his wake. I raised a brow. Are you really not going to go? Besides, I'm technically in charge, so you have to go anyway. They all looked at each other, deliberating on what to do at that moment. Then, they nodded at me, having come to a decision. With that, they all vanished in a burst of speed, leaving me here to guard the area. With that, I sat down and carefully paid attention to my surroundings with a serious gaze. I couldn't understand why my instinct was acting up as I couldn't sense anything. I didn't bother to understand who or what was about to attack me. I simply moved. I launched my body off of the torii gate I had been on, and no sooner did something from the above crash into and destroy it with devastating force. As I traveled through the air, I turned my body to see what had tried to attack me. And it was then I realized. It wasn't what had tried to attack me. It was who. I immediately flipped and landed on the ground before quickly observing the intruder. He was an individual with an average height who wore a purple-lined black hooded cloak and a yellow mask with a black flame-like pattern, a single eye hole visible on it. He looked at me. And moved. My eye sharpened as he suddenly appeared in front of me, his fist poised to strike. He was so fast that I was unable to react before I was struck in the face, my cheek rippling from the impact and my body sent flying away. I tumbled and bounced across the ground while my body demolished the trees in its path until all my kinetic energy was used up as I slid to a stop. As the dust settled, I opened my eye and spit out the blood from my mouth before wiping my lips. I groggily stood up and couldn't help the chill that pervaded my spine. I hadn't sensed that individual when he had first arrived. That should have been impossible. As long as you were alive and in front of me, I could sense you. That's what had always happened. Yet, not only had I not sensed him, I hadn't been able to sense his emotions. It was like he was a ghost. Like he didn't exist. It was only when he had struck me for that brief moment that I had sensed his chakra. And I recalled it. I felt a familiar chakra signature. It was the same bizarre signature I had felt over a year ago. The same one that had been there when Rin had died. My body tense and instinct telling me to go the other way, my eyes glowed as I scanned his strength. I tensed. He was strong. I ducked, my head narrowly avoiding the fist that suddenly passed over my head. I jumped forward with a quick tuck and roll before I slid to a stop and steadied my breath. And he is very fast. I thought, in trepidation. This enemy was powerful. He had unknown skills. Unknown motives. My pupils shrank and I hurriedly crossed my arms in front of my chest before a devastating kick shattered my arms. I coughed out blood as my body was sent rocketing backward before I felt my back brutally impact the face of the mountain, a crater forming and enlarging immensely in response. Then, I felt a hand around my neck before it squeezed hard, and while I didn't need air to breathe, the feeling of my neck getting crushed wasn't pleasant. It was apparent to me that I couldn't win with my base strength. In that case. Sage Transformation Mode. Third-person POV. Yoru's body began to transform. Pristine white reptilian scales appeared on portions of his body, covering the outer edges of his face and extending down from the side of his neck to the sides and back of his arms, upper body, and lower body. His eyes changed color, turning golden from their original silver coloring. His pupils transformed, becoming narrowed and slit. Like a snake's. 2 pristine horns grew from either side of his head. His hair became fiery white as it radiated energy. A brilliant cloak of pure white energy covered his body, the winds churning in response. The rocks behind Yoru cracked while portions of his white chakra shroud formed into ethereal snakes that moved and coiled around his body. The entire transformation took mere moments. Then, he opened his eyes, his pupils constricting. "Unhand me, scum." The 9 white energy-born snakes all opened their mouths as energy coalesced within before they fired devastating beams of energy at the masked man. The entire process happened so quickly and at point-blank range, the masked man was unable to react in time. He was blasted away into the distance and crashed into the forest and traveled to the distance, leaving a trail of dirt, debris, and splinters as his body leveled the obstacles in its path. Yoru dusted himself off before he snapped his fingers. Numerous dense particles of magnetic metals emerged from the ground before they coalesced to form a large metallic throne. Yoru sat down and crossed his legs before he rested his arm on the armrest of the metal throne. He leaned his cheek onto the back of his palm and utilized his magnet release to levitate his throne in the air. He flew forward in a vertical motion, his gaze impassive, as he followed the path of bare dirt and destruction. As he could not sense the intruder's chakra, Yoru used his other senses in order to pinpoint his enemy. The enemy was. It barely qualified as danger to Yoru as he turned to face the sudden attack from above. Seeing the enemy using the same tactic twice, Yoru kept his expression stoic. He spun his throne of metal around towards the intruder and immediately expelled an immense amount of majestic destroyer flames which engulfed the enemy. Ho! Yoru thought as an arm shot out from the blast of fire and reached towards his face. Just as Yoru thought it would touch him, the arm phased through his face. Yoru easily understood that the enemy was trying to ensnare him with the chain he held between his hands, yet his expression remained unchanged. Useless. Magnet release. By his will, just as the chain was about to wrap around him, it stopped. Yoru waved his hand. The chain and its owner flew into the distance with immense speeds as Yoru brought them further away from the birth chamber. He continued his flight on his metallic throne and followed after the masked man. Said individual, however, immediately righted himself in midair and flipped before dragging his feet on the ground and coming to a halt. The masked man then stood up and watched the approaching Yoru before dusting himself off. In a swirl of distorted space, the chain between the masked man's hands disappeared. Yoru looked down at him from above and outstretched his free hand before manipulating the natural energy in the atmosphere and saturating the ground with it. In Sage mode, he could instinctually infuse inanimate objects with natural energy and give them life, making them much easier to manipulate. Let's see how well you can dance. With those words, he spread his fingers. Immediately after, the ground began to squiggle and squirm as if they were made of liquidated rubber. Numerous large snake-like forms began to materialize from the earth before launching themselves at the masked man. The masked man crouched low before launching himself off the ground right before the wriggling snake-like pieces of earth impacted the area he had previously been in. He dodged and weaved through the serpentine appendages of the earth that continually sought to ensnare him while his feet rapidly traversed across the ground. His eyes half-lidded in apathy, Yoru twitched his fingers. Suddenly, the ground beneath the masked man caved in, causing him to sink beneath as if he was standing on an elastic ball. Yoru then pinched all 5 of his fingers together, causing the ground to close up above the masked man in response. A spike of wood erupted from beneath the ground where the masked man was buried. Yoru's slitted pupils gleamed. Then another spike of wood emerged from the earth. And another. Abruptly, gigantic squirming tree roots erupted from the ground all around the area the masked man had been sealed in. He then emerged from the dirt and slapped his hands on the ground. The entire area, a kilometer around, trembled as large thick tree roots sprung up from the earth before launching themselves towards Yoru in the sky. His gaze indifferent, Yoru mentally commanded his throne of metal to zoom through the air in evasive maneuvers. The tree roots pierced through the air as they inched closer towards Yoru, who remained sitting cross-legged on his throne with an impassive gaze. With a thought, the metallic throne suddenly tilted to the left, narrowly dodging the tree root from behind that grazed it. Feeling the numerous tree roots coming from below, Yoru tilted his throne backward 180 degrees. The tree roots skimmed past the back of his throne while Yoru remained sitting on it upside down. He then turned his gaze towards where the masked man was in the distance. Suddenly, shadows covered his form as numerous tree roots appeared and moved to encapsulate him in midair. They blanketed and overarched him from above while his cardinal directions were sealed. There was nowhere to run as more branches appeared from below in order to ensnare Yoru in a cocoon of wood. Yet, he still remained phlegmatic. Sage art. The roots had already almost completely surrounded him, the only part of his body still exposed to the moonlight being his gleaming golden eyes. Storm style. Large amounts of energy began to gather in the mouths of the ethereal snakes born from Yoru's white chakra shroud. Just as the last ray of moonlight was to be snatched away from his eyes. His slit pupils constricted. Light fong. Immensely powerful beams of light were launched from the snake's mouths in every which direction, slicing through the tree branches and shearing a small mountain in the distance. The heat from the attack caused the sliced-up portions of wood to glow red and smoke up while the mountain peak slowly slid off. Yoru looked past the splintering debris and settled his gaze on the masked man in the distance who was rapidly going through hand seals. Snake ram hairdog snake. As soon as the last seal was complete, the masked man's chakra suddenly flared immensely as the ground began to tremble. A beastly roar was heard from beneath the surface of the earth before a serpentine dragon made of wood burst out from the ground and emitted a booming howl. Its eyes locked onto Yoru's before it exclaimed once more, the shockwaves from its effort tearing apart all the obstacles in front of it. Yoru's lips downturned slightly. He pointed his free hand's index finger at the beast and gathered energy on its tip. Sage art, scorch style. A miniature white sun began to form and enlarge on the tip of Yoru's finger. An immense amount of heat radiated from the white ball of energy, the air distorting and the moisture in the atmosphere evaporating near instantly. Yoru looked at the aggressive approach of the wood dragon in displeasure. The first Hokage's iteration of this technique would have been much more majestic than your imitation. He continued in distaste. You faker. Noble son. The orb of energy was launched from Yoru's fingertip and brutally clashed with the charging wood dragon, instantly pushing it back. The wood construct roared in distress as it flew away, its body's moisture being sucked away while smoke emerged all over its form. The masked man's eyes widened underneath his mask before he rapidly flipped through hand seals and drained his chakra. In response to his efforts, two more wood dragon constructs erupted from the earth and assisted the first one in pushing back the 25-meter diameter white sun. Roaring in defiance, they charged ahead and clashed against the ball while simultaneously making an effort to absorb its energy. Their resulting efforts caused the large ball of energy to get pushed back towards Yoru while its energy was siphoned by the wood constructs. Their howls reverberated throughout the battlefield. Yoru looked on blandly. He pinched all 5 of his free hand's fingers together. Suddenly, the gigantic white ball of energy imploded. Then, a pause. Yoru's slitted pupils constricted. Supernova. It erupted. Violently. In a dreadful and powerful burst, the star exploded in a dome-shaped blast of heat and energy. The dragons were easily blasted away and vaporized as they gave unwilling roars in response. The earth and trees in the path of the blast wave vanished while the blast radius of the detonations spread for kilometers on end. A shockwave from the discharge leveled small hills and trees further in the distance. Yoro sat stably in the air while the wind from the explosion rustled his hair. He turned his half-lidded gaze down towards the destruction below and witnessed the gigantic 5-kilometer-wide crater his son's detonation had hollowed. Whatever parts of the ground that hadn't been vaporized from the heat now glowed an unholy red as lava flowed across the land. Yoro's gleaming golden eyes scanned the terrain before his slitted pupils contracted as they focused in on a specific domain. With a thought, his metallic throne bolted towards the ground below before it immediately halted right above the lava. With another mental command, the Yoro blitzed across the lake of lava at immense speeds while sitting cross-legged on his chair. It then abruptly halted. Looking down at the hunched-over form of the masked man, Yoro dissipated his throne, the particles of metal that made it up vanishing to his inventory. He would use it to make another throne next time. With that, Yoro used his chakra to keep himself afloat on the lava and regarded the masked man with a tilt of his head. You are truly impetuous, to come into my territory with such a paltry level of power. The masked man looked up at Yoro. And blurred. Yoro promptly tilted his head to the side, causing the slash attack from the masked man to miss its mark. The assailant then twirled his kunai and poised its blade to strike downward before jabbing it at Yoro. The only result was the ding sound of metal clashing against metal as Yoro augmented his neck with steel release. At speeds the masked man was unable to react to, Yoro shot out his hand and grabbed the man's wrist. Before crushing it. The masked man grunted and quickly phased his arm through Yoro's own. In a rapid motion, he twisted his body and spun a kick towards Yoro's head. Yoro remained impassive as the blow phased through his skull before he immediately outstretched his left hand and caught the masked man's leg. At that very instant, the masked man flipped through hand seals in rapid succession and expelled a giant ball of fire at Yoro at point-blank range. Yoro merely outstretched his right hand before the attack impacted it. Utilizing his dark release, Yoro absorbed the energy from the fireball. An attack brutally impacted Yoro's chin from below, causing his body to launch upwards. It was only thanks to his instinctual use of steel release that the spike of wood that had tried to pierce through his skull failed to do so. With a simply backflip, Yoro landed and splashed a bit of the lava flowing beneath the soles of his feet. The masked man was suddenly upon him. Yoro weaved left to dodge the punch that had been aimed at his face before he clenched his fist and rammed it into the masked man's abdomen, causing it to sink deep within. The masked man coughed while his body was forced to slide backward across the lava. In a mere moment he righted himself up and dashed towards Yoro before he struck out once more. Using the back of his palm, Yoro deflected the attack. The masked man immediately followed up with a spin kick towards Yoro's face. Yoro tilted his head back, the wind from the attack causing his hair to flutter slightly. He then righted himself back up before pounding his fist on the masked man's exposed side, causing a crack to sound. The masked man groaned in protest, however, he pushed past the pain and ensnared Yoro's arm in his own before space began to spin and distort from his eye. Yoro's eyes gleamed. ID create, empty. He vanished. The masked man looked every which way in trepidation before he felt a brutal impact on his back, his spine creaking in protest. His body skipped and bounced across the lava before he slid to a stop. Just as he was able to get himself back up on his legs, his chin was brutally impacted by Yoro's knee, causing his head to snap back harshly and his body to lift off the ground. Yoro didn't allow him to get far, however, as he grabbed the masked man's leg as he was in the air and slammed him down onto the lake of lava below. The vicious impact caused tidal waves of lava to ripple and spread to the distance. "What's wrong?" Yoro asked uncaringly. "You're not using your phasing, it's almost as if you've given up," he said before his pupils abruptly constricted. Yoro promptly leaped back as two miniature wood dragons erupted from the lava and chased after him. The masked man utilized that instant to activate his space-time technique, space distorting in a spiral manner in response. He was instantly forced to halt as a white sun appeared to the side of him and slammed into his body. He groaned in anguish from the heat and power of the attack before he was explosively launched into the distance. He landed unceremoniously on the ground and looked up to see the ashy remains of his wood constructs dissipating in the wind. Yoru then pointed his index finger in the air. "Since you were so eager to intrude upon my domain. Sage art, scorch style." A gargantuan pure white ball in the shape and likeness of a sun formed on the tip of Yoru's finger and enlarged to immense proportions. "You can rest here eternally. Noble sun." Yoru launched the attack. It was as if time had slowed as the masked man watched the huge white sun approach him. Before he was engulfed, Yoru pinched his fingers together, his gaze passionless. Supernova. The giant ball of white heat and energy shrank unto itself. Then, it burst. And then the world was filled with white. Yoru emerged from the devastation unharmed before he looked around and noted that the surroundings were even more devastated than before. With that, he made his way towards where the corpse of his assailant was and, in a few steps, he arrived in front of the body. He looked down at it with his gaze ever apathetic, recognizing that it was burnt beyond all recognition. He stared at it for a few more moments and spread out his senses. After sensing no other chakra signatures or emotional signatures in the immediate surroundings, Yoru turned away. My presence is no longer required. With that, his transformation regressed as his scales and horns disappeared while his eyes returned to their normal silver hue. Yoru looked back down at the corpse, realizing that he would probably never know who he was or why the enemy had attacked. He then turned his gaze to the distance and looked at the rampaging four-tailed gorilla before he narrowed his eyes. Sun was still moving in a frenzy, indiscriminately attacking and destroying everything in sight. If Yoru was right and the person he had killed had been controlling the tailed beast somehow, then Sun should have at the very least calmed down by now. Taking a closer look, Yoru then noticed something that caused his heart to palpitate. He hadn't noticed it earlier because he hadn't paid as close attention since the monkey's eyes had always been red. It was only now that he was carefully observing Son Goku that Yoru realized that Sun's red eyes contained a pattern he was very familiar with. 3 tomo patterned around the pupil. And Uchiha is responsible? But where did they even find him and how can they control a tailed beast? Numerous questions and thoughts flitted through Yoru's mind as pieces of information began to interconnect like pieces of a puzzle. The Sharingan. The masked man's despair. Kakashi's chakra mutation. Itachi's chakra mutation. An evolved Sharingan. Yoru's eyes widened as a picture began to form from the information he went through in his mind. However, he immediately abandoned that thought. If the masked man was who Yoru thought he might have been and had somehow gotten control of Sun, then the gorilla wouldn't still be ramping since the masked man was now dead. For now, he could sit down and recover his chakra before going out there to help with the situation. It came much too suddenly and unexpectedly. An arm tore through Yoru's chest, penetrating his heart and exiting his back. His eyes wide, Yoru watched as his heart was brutally torn out of his body. You cost me an eye. The masked man said from behind him. Yoru coughed out blood and shakily turned his head to see the corpse of his enemy dissipate like smoke. Just as he tried to gather natural energy, 5 miniature wood dragon constructs erupted from the ground around him and assaulted him ruthlessly. 2 tore into his legs with their teeth, another 2 brutalized his arms, and the last one crushed his neck. Yoru could neither move, speak, nor groan as his chakra was siphoned from the wood constructs. His low and draining chakra reserves prevented him from forming Senjutsu chakra. Then, a pause. Like his chakra, the light in Yoru's eyes began to fade. Until he was left with nothing. The wood constructs soon stopped before regressing underground. Yoru's body then dropped to the ground and remained motionless while his eyes became dull. Blood pooled from the hole in his chest. The masked man looked down at Yoru's body before he turned away and looked towards the distance at the place where Kushina should have been giving birth by now. His fight with Yoru had caused them to move far away from his target area, so the masked man spared Yoru's corpse one more glance before quickly making his way towards the barrier. He immediately entered it and dashed deeper into the cave, his Sharingan scanning the area for any chakra signatures. Then he paused. Where are they? He thought as he turned his head every which way, yet he could not find any trail of the fourth Hokage and his wife. How? Forgetting the fact that he knew that Kushina should be giving birth by now, this room was not only the place where she should have been doing so, but it was small. That being the case, he should have easily come across them. But they weren't here. Why? The masked man continued to look around fruitlessly. But it was no use. My intelligence from Zetsu can't be wrong. They should have come here after she went into labor. I take it you haven't found what you were looking for. The masked man widened his eyes and turned his head to see Yoro standing there with his hands clasped behind his back. His expression was limpid. The white aura circulating around him gave off a feeling of immense pressure. His ethereal snakes hissed in displeasure towards the masked man. What is going on? The masked man thought as he turned around to face his opposition. I literally ripped his heart out. How can he still survive and still have so much power after that? He thought as he saw the wound on Yoru's chest rapidly close. This was some grade A bullshit. It was right up there with Hashirama's cells. His mask hid his incredulity as he asked, where are they? Yoru disdained to answer. He simply said, rejoice. You can again die by my hand. It was a simple statement. No, an edict of truth. Yoru took a simple step forward. Mud release, landslide. His chakra flowed through the ground and into the walls of earth surrounding them before it trembled. The masked man's eye widened a minuscule amount as the entire room collapsed into mud and created a landslide that rushed towards him. At the moment the enemy was preoccupied, Yoru pulled out a kunai and tossed it high into the air. The masked man hurriedly jumped back from the landslide, however, the moment his feet touched the ground, an iron spear penetrated his foot. He grunted in pain at the assault. In that very instant, Yoru appeared right in front of the masked man, his sudden emergence allowing little time for the enemy to react. His Rasengan was launched forward at immense velocities, aimed straight at the man's face with no remorse. It phased through. The outcome will always be the same. The masked man thought as Yoru's body fully passed through his own. He reached out his hand to grab a hold of Yoru, intent on simply banishing him to his Kamui dimension for all the trouble he was worth. However, the instant his fingertips so much as touched Yoru, at that very moment, the kunai Yoru had launched earlier appeared right behind the masked man. Amanoto Kotachi. A high-pitched sound of swirling energy was heard as a Rasengan launched itself into the man's unsuspecting back. And hit. Hard. Shit. The masked man thought as his back was shredded apart from the sudden unforeseeable attack. Yoru's speed and reactivity were much greater than he had anticipated or ever experienced. An explosion sounded out as the masked man's body cratered the ground beneath him, cracks spreading through and caving in the earth. His form sunk deeper within the earth as the residual energy from the Rasengan blew up the interior of the cave in its entirety, causing the entire mountain to completely break down and crumble. His hand still on his enemy's back, Yoru charged his next attack, sparks of lightning flying from his hand. Lightning style. But just as he was about to release it, the masked man phased underground. Yoru furrowed his brows and reabsorbed the energy from the attack before he stood up and turned around. There he saw the masked man from earlier was standing on the complete opposite end of the crater, his robe completely torn and his mask fractured. Yoru looked at him in slight interest. You shouldn't be alive. Yoru meant that in more ways than one. Neither should you. He replied before grunting and grabbing his right arm in pain. Yoru watched as the man's arm literally fell off and thumped on the ground. I'll admit my loss for today. The masked man stated before space distorted and spun around him. Fighting you now is fruitless. He disappeared. Yoru observed where he had disappeared from for a moment longer. It seems like he too has a limit as to how much he can cheat death. With that, Yoru exited Sage Mode. Yoru, gamer. The tension never left me as I kept my body on guard while looking at the place the masked man had vanished from. Could he truly be? That level of skill and power and his strange spacetime technique, how could he have that much strength? Maybe I was mistaken? Improving that much in such a short amount of time, unless he had gained my ability somehow, I found it unlikely. It might or might not be him, but there's no time to think about this now. The battle between me and the masked man had lasted longer than I would have liked. I had even lost a life for the day. I shook my head and looked to the direction that I could sense sun. My face turned unsightly. Dense. Too dense. Sun was gathering such a dense amount of chakra that it made me queasy just from sensing it. Large amounts of positive black chakra and small amounts of negative white chakra were being gathered in Sun's mouth before being shaped into a dark ball of massive energy. This is bad. Just as I thought this. Suddenly from above, a gigantic toad dropped from the sky and descended upon Sun's face just before the bijou could complete his tailed beast ball. With the attack sealed within his own mouth, there was no room for Sun to release it, causing it to detonate within him, smoke leaking from his mouth. I released a breath for a moment before my eyes sharpened. This couldn't go on for long. I sat down in meditation for less than a minute before I regained all my chakra. Next, in multiple puffs, 3 clones of myself appeared all around me. Clone 1 quickly hurried to where IWA was meeting with the third. Clone 2 dashed off towards the area Minato had told me Kumo was purportedly staying. And Clone 3. I don't need to tell you this. I said to my final clone. But if there is anyone with him, slaughter them, but make sure you keep his life intact. The clone looked back at me with an impassive gaze. For anyone who dares to go after Mito, there is no mercy. I nodded at the unspoken words before the clone vanished in a blur using swift release. Now then, I thought, gazing at the area the masked man had disappeared in. More specifically, the arm that had fallen off of the individual and was now laying on the ground. What or who are you? Yoru, gamer. Kakashi sat on the roof of the Hokage's home and looked up to the brilliant moon in the night sky. Many thoughts flitted through his mind in this moment of tranquility. Until it was abruptly shattered. The descent of an unholy pressure snapped Kakashi out of his reminiscence as he turned to the source only for his single visible eye to widen. Son Goku. How? Why? He could hear the bijou roar and slam its fists into its chest, its howl sending shockwaves throughout the village, shattering windows along the way. Screams of terror sounded out as the village began to flee towards the bunkers located under the Hokage mountain. What is going on? Kakashi asked himself while he saw numerous people below pass by the house and run to the distance. Suddenly, his eyes widened. Mito. He jumped down from the roof and pushed open the front door of the house before scanning the house. He couldn't see her form at first glance, so he pulled up his headband and looked around with his activated Sharingan. In but a moment, he found her chakra signature, so he hurriedly moved to her spot. Mito, he said, seeing her huddled against herself on the ground, her body trembling in shock and fear while Yoru's white snake was calmly coiled around her. As Kakashi was already aware of Livia, he didn't spare it a glance as he went to comfort the girl. What's wrong, Mito? She sniffled and trembled as she looked at him with tears eyes. The chakra, it's too. Kakashi immediately understood. He wasn't even a sensor and he could feel how stifling and dark the chakra emanating from Son Goku was. He could only imagine how much a young sensor such as Mito was suffering. It made him wonder how much Sun had been holding himself back when they first met and what had caused him to go on a rampage now. It's all right, he said, hugging her to him as he kneeled down to her level and hugged her to his chest. As she cried and wrapped her arms around him, Kakashi patted her head and looked at her softly. Firstly, I have to get her to safety. At this time, there should be shinobi headed towards the safety bunkers. With his course of action decided, he picked Mito up and left the house. He paused. With his Sharingan, he could see that there were 3 chakra signatures making their way in his direction. The bunkers were located in the opposite direction. Friendlies here to warn the Hokage? Or Mito? Kakashi began, looking at the girl in his arms with a grave expression. Hide. She looked at his serious expression and nodded before wiping her tears and running into the house. Kakashi closed the door behind him and looked ahead, waiting for a few moments before he spoke. Come out. Interesting, it seems like the Sharingan isn't as bad as the Byakugan. A slimy voice filled with disdain spoke before 3 figures appeared in front of Kakashi. Each had a Kumo forehead protector which gleamed in the light of the full moon. He narrowed his eyes. Why are you here? If it's to talk to the Hokage, he isn't in right now. Ha ha ha. No. The lead Kumo shinobi looked at Kakashi with a sickening smile. I'm simply here to complete a mission my predecessors failed to finish. At that, the 3 of them got into a fighting stance. At this moment, all the Konoha shinobi were focused on guiding civilians to safety or defending against the 4-tailed monkey. There was a chance someone would come here to tell the Hokage, but any normal individual would already assume that he was aware of the problem currently plaguing the village. It was pretty hard to miss a gigantic 4-tailed monkey in the middle of the village. That being said, some would probably still come over if not to ask for orders. All he had to do was stall for time. Kakashi bent his knees low and took out a kunai, understanding that there was no room for compromise. Kill him. The lead Kumo shinobi stated. The other 2 dashed towards Kakashi with tanto in hand. An overhead slash came down upon Kakashi, who deftly switched his kunai into a reverse grip and deflected the attack, the blade gliding off his own. At the same instant, a horizontal slash came from his left side. Kakashi's Sharingan easily picked up the movement, and at the last instant, he jumped up, allowing the tanto to pass fruitlessly below him. At that instant, Kakashi spun and dug his heels into the face of the owner of that sword. The Kumonin grunted and flew back, while the first one to have attacked Kakashi shifted his blade and brought it up towards the Sharingan owner from its previously down position. Kakashi immediately backflipped to avoid the attack and landed softly on the ground before he went through hand seals in quick succession. Fire style, fireball jutsu. A great ball of fire was launched towards the first attacking Kumonin. The individual charged his tanto with lightning in response and sliced the ball of fire that was covering his vision. The Kumo shinobi then widened his eyes as he suddenly lost sight of his opponent and looked front, back, left, right, up. Kakashi popped up from underground, his red eye gleaming before he dug his kunai into his opponent's calcaneal tendon, better known as his Achilles heel. Arg! The Kumo shinobi screamed as he dropped to one knee, his neck now eye level with Kakashi's face. Hatake immediately capitalized on this opportunity and raised his blade to slice his opponent's jugular. Kakashi immediately jumped to the side as a beam of electricity was shot at his face from the shinobi he had kicked away earlier. He did a few back handsprings to distance himself before sliding to a stop. With one enemy more or less immobilized, Kakashi focused on the enemy that had attacked him before his eye widened. There was still one more of them. Shit! Mito! Kakashi thought as he turned to face the door of the Uzumaki Namake's household. Arg! Fuck! The lead Kumo shinobi stated as his body was shocked by the defensive seals in place and harshly flew back before brutally impacting the walls of a house across the street. Kakashi breathed a sigh of relief. I sometimes forget about those dash. Goosebumps appeared on Kakashi's skin as his body moved on instinct and ducked right before a blade pierced the air where his head had been. Close. Kakashi thought as he placed his palms on the ground before sweeping the feet underneath his opponent. The Kumonin moved to right himself. Kakashi flipped through a couple of hand seals and placed his palms on the ground. Earth release, earth flow spears. The earth beneath the falling Kumonin was condensed and shaped into spikes that protruded from the ground and skewered him. The Kumo shinobi screamed and gurgled blood before his body became limp. At that moment, Kakashi heard the sound of explosions coming from beside him and he turned to see the lead Kumo shinobi was attacking the Uzumaki Namake's home relentlessly with his lightning techniques. That's bad, Kakashi thought. The security seals placed on the house were mainly used to keep unwanted people out, but they weren't built to sustain large amounts of damage. After all, who would be stupid enough to so blatantly and flagrantly attack the 4th Hokage's residence in the middle of the village? Right before he was about to go stop him, a blade of electricity came his way, forcing him to retreat further away from his objective. Turning his gaze towards the perpetrator, Kakashi saw that it had been the Kumo nin he had slightly disabled earlier. I need to finish this quickly, Kakashi thought before flipping hand seals and placing his palms on the ground. Earth release, earth flow spears. His chakra traveled through the ground and under his enemy before it began to mold the earth beneath, however, just as the spears of earth protruded from the ground. The Kumo nin ran lightning chakra through his blade and stabbed it below, the lightning release chakra neutralizing Kakashi's earth technique. Of course it wouldn't be this easy, Kakashi thought as he readied his kunai before sparing a quick glance at the head Kumo shinobi who was still trying to break down the door. The injured Kumo nin looked at his dead comrade before gazing at Kakashi with a grimace on his face. He stood up on his one good leg. Kakashi crouched low. They moved. Lightning caressing his blade, the Kumo ninja shot out blades of sharpened electric attacks at the incoming Kakashi. The white-haired Hataki's Sharingan rapidly processed the incoming attack as he rapidly dashed forward towards his enemy. The sharpened electric waves blanketed his vision, however, his eyeballs swished back and forth as he located every possible avenue he could use to dodge. And he did. He dashed left and right, dodging each blade of lightning that came his way with the absolute minimum movement necessary in order to maintain his momentum. With his quickly moving feet, Kakashi inched closer and closer to his opponent who clenched his teeth tightly. Seeing as Kakashi was too close, the Kumo nin stopped shooting out blades of lightning and prepared for close-quarter combat. They clashed. Kunai met Tanto in a clang while sparks discharged from the blade's point of contact. Kakashi narrowed his eyes as his body was pushed back by his opponent's superior strength. He backflipped and landed softly. An explosion and the sound of breakage sounded out as dust and debris flew throughout the battlefield. Ha ha! Finally! Shit! Kakashi thought as he turned towards the lead Kumo ninja and rushed to stop him. I can't let you do that. The voice of the injured Kumo shinobi sounded out, accompanied by a bolt of lightning which slammed into Kakashi. He was thrown back and away from the Uzumaki Namake's household before he grit his teeth. With a flip, his feet dragged across the ground before friction allowed his body to halt to a stop. Kakashi's eyes narrowed. I have to finish this immediately. The sound of 1,000 birds chirping echoed throughout the area as a high concentration of electricity gathered in Kakashi's right hand. The Kumo shinobi tensed and raised his blade in preparation for an attack. Kakashi dashed. In little time, the white-haired Konoha Jonin was upon his opponent. At the same instant, the Kumo Jonin lowered his blade to bisect Kakashi. He was aiming for mutually assured destruction. Unfortunately, Kakashi thought, twisting his body mid-motion. My eye can see all your attacks. The blade of the Kumo shinobi lightly grazed Kakashi's skin, however, the Konoha shinobi was relatively unharmed as he found himself inside his enemy's guard and thrust the ball of lightning through his chest. Kakashi's hand pierced through like a hot knife through butter and exited out of the Kumo ninja's back. Time seemed to be frozen. The light in the Kumobikure shinobi's eyes dimmed before his tanto helplessly clanged on the ground. With his body no longer able to support itself, the shinobi died, the weight of his body leaning fully against Kakashi. The silver-haired Jonin of the leaf pushed the enemy's body off him before he hurriedly rushed towards the house. Please let me make it, he thought as he made it to the door of the Uzumaki Namake's estate. Ah! A scream erupted from inside the house, however. It was not from Mito. Fuck! You stupid snake! Kakashi immediately ran towards the sound of the scream and generated lighting in his hand. And then... No! Livia! Mito screamed. There! Kakashi thought as he dashed into the room. His eyes magnified in shock. Oh no! It was there he saw Mito on the ground weeping as she held Livia in hand. Both her halves. Blood gushed from the snake and spilled onto the floor. Who the hell gives a kid a pet snake? The Kumo ninja snarled as he cradled his right arm, discolored veins protruding from them. Kakashi narrowed his eyes as he noticed his enemy's moment of weakness and quickly dashed forward with his fully charged Chidori. The Kumo ninja paused his action and glared at Kakashi's direction before he made a split decision to dash away and jump out the room's window. Kakashi being here meant that he had killed the Kumo ninja's comrades. The Kumo shinobi wasn't certain of his ability to fight the kid while he himself was injured. Kakashi watched the man run away before deciding not to pursue as it might have been a setup. He sighed and looked down to Mito, who was carefully holding onto the unmoving Livia with a forlorn gaze. Let's go, he said as he placed a hand on her shoulder. But Livia, Mito murmured. Kakashi's gaze softened. There's nothing we can dash. Without warning, the two halves of Livia wriggled before being drawn together. Both Kakashi and Mito were shocked, the latter so much so that she dropped the white snake. That watched as the top and bottom half of Livia joined back together before the snake opened its mouth in what seemed like a yawn. Kakashi stared incredulously. Livia! Mito yelled as she grasped the snake and rubbed her cheek against it in joy. The reception of such happiness stuck out its forked tongue, her close proximity with Mito causing it to stroke the red-haired girl's cheek. The girl giggled. Kakashi was just confused. Did she lick Mito's cheek on purpose like a dog? Or did she just stick out her tongue habitually like a normal snake? Wait, now's not the time. Let's go, Mito, Kakashi stated. I'll take her to one of Minato-sensei's safe houses. With Livia now back in one piece, literally, Mito joyfully nodded her head. With that, Kakashi picked her up and quickly exited the house, before making his way to the safe house. Yoru, gamer. The Kumo ninja ran to the distance and traveled towards Konoha's gates. With the mission of failure and with Konoha no doubt too busy trying to stop the rampaging gorilla, there was absolutely no need for him to remain here any longer. Besides, as long as the other group captures their target, this mission can be said to be considered a sucky ugh. The Kumo ninja groaned as his arm throbbed in pain. Fucking snake, he thought with a grimace, and he supported his arm. Whatever type of snake it was, its venom was extremely potent. It was quite thankful that the snake seemed to be only a newborn and so its venom wasn't quite as strong as it could have been. The Kumo-bin frowned as his feet carried him across the village house rooftops. Seriously, what type of person gives a kid a venomous snake? Me. The Kumo-nin's heart lurched at the unexpected reply and he hurriedly stopped and turned around every which way to find the owner of the voice. Who's there? He snarled. Since he was running the opposite direction of everyone else, there shouldn't have been anyone here in the immediate vicinity. He froze. A presence was behind him. He hurriedly jumped forward and turned around in midair to face his opponent before landing on the ground. His eyes widened in recognition before he snarled. You? So, you were aiming for my sister? Yoroclone said as he stood calmly across his opponent. The Kumo-nin grimaced as he stared at the white-haired boy across from him with a vicious expression. I didn't expect I would get to see you alive anytime soon. Now, I'm going to kill you, he said, disregarding the pain in his arm as he pulled out a tanto from his back. Yoro smiled tauntingly. Garbage like you? With a grim look, the Kumo shinobi dashed towards Yoroclone with his tanto raised high and brought it down. However, pathetic, Yoroclone stated as he raised his arm and utilized steel release to augment it to immense levels, his appendage turning a black luster in response. The Kumo-nin's eyes widened as his tanto made contact with Yoru's fortified skin. And snapped. Impasse dash. Before the Kumo shinobi could complete his mental sentence, he heard and felt something crack. Arg! He screamed as he dropped to the ground as his right leg bent in the wrong direction. He was given no opportunity to recover as a knee slammed into his face, cracking and caving it in before his head slammed against the ground. Suddenly, he felt a weight on his chest. He shakily looked up to see Yoru look down at him with his gleaming silver eyes, Yoru's foot on his chest. He shivered. That gaze. The Kumo shinobi felt as if his presence was so utterly insignificant in that gaze as if he was worth less than the dog turd that littered the ground. Yoru grabbed both of the Kumo shinobi's arms and lifted them while his foot kept the Kumo shinobi grounded. The Kumo-nin's eyes magnified. What are you? Yoru pulled. Slowly. Arfg. The Kumo-nin screamed as his shoulders were dislocated before his arms were slowly torn out of his body. Blood sprayed like a fountain from the now empty arm sockets as the Kumo-nin flailed in agony. Yoru simply tossed the arms aside like trash. He then kneeled down and placed his palms on the profusely bleeding empty sockets. Lava release. He cauterized the wound. Screams of agony followed as the Kumo shinobi felt and smelt his flesh burn. With that, Yoru looked back at his captor's eyes. Wait please. The Kumo ninja stuttered in fear. Did you know that some of Konoha's medical ninjas have the ability to regenerate lost limbs? Yoru asked, though he seemed uninterested in the answer. The Kumo shinobi widened his eyes at the implication. It was something now quite well known. No one knew how, but every shinobi village knew this fact. As for why Yoru asked him that question, the Kumo ninja knew. He wasn't stupid. Well, that's stupid. He was going to be tortured horrifically. Yoru looked at him with a calm smile, but to the Kumo ninja, it was the vilest expression he had ever seen. Now then, tell me why you thought it was a good idea to target my adorable Mito. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket past going to the different worlds of anime fanfiction. Looking forward to having you on board again.